Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jerusalem Rivera Wilson with the School of Education at the University of Albany, and this is edTrends. Today's topic, the P-12 Challenge, Shortage, Preparation, Recruitment, and Retention of Future Teachers. This is a special session. It will be from 4 to 5:30, and we have a distinguished group of panelists that will be introduced shortly. For more information about today's session and future sessions, please visit atlased.org. To learn more about Atlas offerings as well as professional development opportunities, visit atlas.ed.org. One of today's panelists, as well as the moderator, is Dr. Ginny Goatley, Interim Dean of the School of Education. Dr. Goatley, will you please introduce the panelists and share your greetings?
Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you to our event today. When we were thinking about this, including NYACTE, NYSATE, our various partners across the state and across the country, we're really looking at pulling together a range of our stakeholders, and both from school perspective, superintendents, higher ed, and so forth. And we hope this panel today will help us have a conversation and get a lot of ideas out there. So Jerry, if you change the slide, I'll start to introduce our panelists. So today, panelists include Alisa Chapman, who's the Executive Director of the Association of Teacher Educators, Christine Dawson, who's the Director of Teacher Preparation at Siena College and is also the NYSATE President, Dr. Chuck Dedrick, Executive Director of the New York State Council of School Superintendents, Dr. Donna DeSiato, the 2022 New York State Superintendent of the Year, Jacob Easley, the Dean of the Graduate School of Education at Touro College and President-elect of NYACTE, Lynn Gangone, who's President and CEO of the American Association of Colleges for Teacher Education, AACTE, Andrea Lachance, the Dean of the School of Education at SUNY Cortland and the NYACTE President, Christina Pfister, a professor at the Lally School of Education and President-elect of NYSATE, and Carly Santangelo, the 2022 New York State Teacher of the Year. And we're pleased to invite and thank all of these people for attending today. It is a rather large panel as panel goes, but we've all promised answers around 2 to 3 minutes just to keep the conversation going. And in part, this was intended to really have a range of voices in our conversation today. So we have various guiding questions we'll be talking about, such as what's causing the teacher shortage, which schools are feeling the teacher shortage most and why, what can state and districts do to address the teacher shortage, and so forth. And those questions we'll go through as a panel with different people addressing, but I strongly encourage you, as you have questions of your own, there is a chat box that's active today. We will be monitoring it, and we will be following the questions and adding the questions as you have them along the way. So Jerry, do you have the slide for me, or do you want me to share my screen? There it goes. All right. Collaboration among stakeholders. So just to get us started, part of this focus was around thinking about recruitment, preparation, and retention of teachers. And certainly we're all involved in that process. And it's a very iterative process, both in recruiting a range of teachers to the profession, new teachers, preparing them well so they're ready to be in our schools, and then thinking about retention, which if we're thinking about teacher shortages, we always want to retain the teachers who have gone through the preparation and are ready to teach. So this is very iterative in terms of part of retention is also further preparation, especially in a state like New York that requires a master's degree, but also through some of the professional learning and development that goes on in the way in which all of us are involved in that. So there's a few pieces of information I'm going to share on the next slide. One is some of the efforts from New York State and looking at teacher shortages. So at the recent Regents meeting, I believe it was December, they shared some information on teacher shortages. This was a report they did in collaboration with the Regional Educational Laboratory, and it looked at some of the data both for initial certification and also additional certifications in New York State. So that's one piece of information. If you don't know that's available, that would be useful for you to know. Jerry will be sharing some of these web links right in the chat shortly, just so you don't have to try and grab them all at the moment. Another piece of national information that's going on is around sharing of information. So we have places like AACTE, who recently updated a report they've done on colleges of education, and that includes some pipeline information. Another recent place is Education Week has information routinely. I just picked one that was the why do teachers leave or don't. They had a series of information around that. And again, all of this is thinking through what is the national portrait around these teacher shortages. And then on the next slide, Jerry, we also have, we're also thinking about places like the Economic Policy Institute. They had a series of articles a couple years ago. They called it the perfect storm in the teacher labor market. We know some of these shortages have been coming based on retirements and other pieces of information. Those reports were mostly pre-pandemic, but so is most of the data we have at the moment that goes through 2018 or 19. Another call for action that's happened recently is really looking at what the U.S. Department of Education is saying. They just came out with a teacher shortage fact sheet in the last couple of weeks, and they're looking at areas such as residency programs, partnerships between EPPs and districts, areas such as loan forgiveness, service scholarships, increasing teacher compensation. They're really looking at how do all of our different stakeholders play a role in helping us solve the situation we're in. And certainly we know right now, we just at the Regents meeting yesterday, there's conversation around teaching residence programs in New York State as well. So that's something that we have been looking into. So as we proceed on to the next slide, Jerry has put that PowerPoint in the chat so that you have those links directly if you want to see them. And but at this point, I'm going to jump right into some of our questions. So let's start with the first one. And as a reminder, if you have questions along the way, please put them right in the chat. Our goal here is to have a conversation today and see what all we can learn from each other as well. So let's start out with what is causing the teacher shortage? And Andrea, how about you jump in on that one?
Sure. When we started talking about this last week in our planning session, one of the things that came to my mind is the idea of the teacher shortage and how, for some people anyway, it seems like just a real shock that we're in a teacher shortage. And I think I've lived in those worlds where the teacher shortage, even though I heard about it in the back of my mind for literally decades, just wasn't a reality. You know, even growing up, both my parents were teachers. My mom stayed home for a bit to raise us as children, tried to get back into the workforce as a teacher, and had to sub for many years actually to get her back to a full-time job. So my whole perception is, well, there's plenty of teachers. Even here at SUNY Cortland, we have many of our students who come from downstate. They want to go back to downstate, lots to go back to Long Island. And for years, we heard from them, oh, I have to be a teaching assistant before I can get my foot in the door. And even our neighborhood district here, Cortland city school districts has never experienced, being right next to one of the biggest preparers of teachers in the state, a teacher shortage, because we've been right here. And even now, in this point in time, we're hearing from Long Island that they're short teachers. We're hearing from our local districts that they're short teachers. And so, you know, the question is, why is this a surprise in some settings? And, you know, for all of us, we know that geography has played a real role over the years in who gets teachers and who doesn't. Pre-pandemic, the Rockefeller Center came out and said there really isn't a teacher shortage in New York State, there's a distribution shortage. So where schools are located and what access they have to population has been a factor there. We also know subject matter has played into the teacher shortages. So when STEM teachers and special ed teachers, you know, the conventional wisdom is they're always needed. Well, in 2008, when the economy crashed and New York State lost about 20,000 teaching jobs, our science education coordinator said this was the first time when he was visiting open house that he couldn't assure parents that their kids who went into science education would have a job. So there was timing involved there. But we also know there's layers that have been there all along and have compressed the ability for people to go into teaching. One of them is pay. That's consistently been an issue in our country, in some places more than others. More recently, working conditions. The joke is you don't even have time to go to the bathroom, let alone have lunch. And in some places that is a reality. It's not a joke. And then even more recently in the last 10 years or so, the real pressure on schools to perform, APPR changes and the like. So when we think about the teacher shortage as we're in this, you know, incredible crisis, it's been bubbling and brewing for a long time, and other parts of the country have known this for quite a while, but it's just hitting us all in very different ways than we've experienced in the past. Thanks.
Thanks, Andrea. Lynn, maybe you could give us a more national perspective as well.
Well, yeah, thanks. And Andrea, thanks for your leadership of the New York ACTE and for all the great work that you do. I'm putting into the chat the press release from AACTE's report on the colleges of education around the country. And I think Andrea did a great job of summarizing some of the challenges that exist with regard to the teacher shortage. You know, one of the things that we forget along the way when we start thinking about the shortage of teachers is that decline in interest in teaching as a profession overall nationally has been significant. And so when we look at national data and we look at undergraduate majors, for example, and we look at major disciplinary areas, education as a major is the only disciplinary area to lose enrollment to the tune of 46% over the past 10 years. And so the decline has been precipitous. It has been over time. Additionally, another, what I think of as sort of fun fact is actually gender related. Some of the decline in interest in teaching, which impacts obviously the teacher shortage, is that women have more career options right now. And so what you see is an increase in women, for example, attending business schools versus women attending education schools. That's a factor. You know, Andrea talked about conditions and prestige. When PDK did their 50th anniversary poll, in addition to polling the public on their perceptions of public education, they also polled teachers. And for the first time in the history of the PDK poll, the majority of teachers said, I would not advise my children to go into teaching as a profession, which to me is a very strong statement. I look at Carly, who's a teacher of the year, who's going to be speaking soon. You know, it is the level of
Lynn, somehow you got There you go.
Okay, I don't know what happened.
I don't know.
So anyway, so the level of resilience and commitment that current teachers have, I think is significant. We also, Andrea was talking about some current trends. I mean, as I said earlier to my fellow panelists, we just finished a seminar that was on educational censorship. So educational gag orders, teacher surveillance. So in addition to having very challenging working conditions, and I'm sure my colleagues who are superintendents can speak to this as well, we now have lots of school boards that and others who are saying, state legislatures who are saying you can and cannot teach these things. We're going to pay attention to what you teach, and if you teach those things, we're going to report you. So we've already taken an environment that we know lacks pay, lacks prestige, and now we've put on top of that teachers worried about how they can teach history, how they can talk about culturally responsive teaching, how they can talk to the many children in their classrooms. So the teacher shortage has become complicated by a lot of environmental factors that we're seeing across the country that are impacting the work. And I'll talk a little bit more later about some different ways of also looking at teaching, not only as a one teacher, one classroom model, but thinking about teaching more in terms of distributed expertise. But I'll save that for another question down the road. Thank you.
Thanks, Lynn. Those are both very helpful ways to get us started on this this journey here today. Thank you, Andrea and Lynn. So our next question is, which schools are feeling the teacher shortage most and why? So Chuck, maybe you can give us a perspective from your perspective.
Happy to. Thanks, Ginny. It was said a little while ago, schools all across New York are now facing it. And the reasons I think are obvious. But I want to mention the reason through a story a little bit. I had a friend who is now retired, who was a teacher, and every morning he would stop at Cumberland Farms and get a cup of coffee. And he wore his badge on his belt that he always had to use to get into the school. He told me he started taking his badge off because of what people said to him when he was getting his coffee. We are losing a public relations war, and we're losing it big time. There's a segment of the media that is doing everything they can to label schools as government schools and do everything they can to push funding and people in a different direction. Somehow, we need to bring things back to center. And one of the ways I think to do that is by having conversations like this, getting people from all across the state together with good ideas to talk about things. One of the issues when it comes to where, I mean, it starts with something like everybody needs substitute teachers. There's some areas of the state, it never used to be. For instance, in the North Country, up near the Canadian border, we had a school district that didn't get an application for an elementary school teacher. That was unheard of back a few years ago, but it's common now. So when you get small school districts, you've got a situation of one section of physics or one section of chemistry. How do you hire a teacher to do one section of something in an area where you can't find an elementary teacher? Thankfully, and I'll give our friends at the State Education Department, they have been some credit on this. They have been moving in the direction of trying to ease the pain a little bit of the certification process and certifications. And hopefully those things will keep on happening. But right now, it's every place in New York. Some places are worse, some places are better. And a lot of it has to do with the population of the area.
Thanks, Chuck. Alisa, could you jump in on this question with a little national? You'll have a little national perspective too.
Sure, I'd love to. So I do want to shed some light from a national perspective, but I also want to state that I have some relative experience in the state of North Carolina and what we have gone through in this particular state. Some of my data reference points are from North Carolina, but I do see similar trends in other states and working with colleagues and EPPs across the United States in the role that I serve in with ATE. We continue to see persistent shortages in high need licensure areas. Those, are those high need areas of math, science, middle grades, and special education. And we also see shortages in rural and hard to staff schools that they often feel the greatest impact of the teacher shortage. And I think that the second part of the question here is, why are these particular schools feeling the shortage the greatest? And that's what I want to address with reference to some data points. Lynn referenced earlier the report that AACTE put out and the overall decline in particular in traditional teacher ed enrollment programs, particularly in North Carolina, that data that I'm very familiar with. There's been a tremendous decline. I think we have to understand those constant supply sources of teachers that supply our states and our public schools with the public school educators that they hire. And that begins to shine a light on understanding these flows of teacher supply and demand. So for example, in North Carolina, about 25% of the teaching workforce is in their first 5 years of service. So it's that's a significant percentage to have such a young years of experience in teaching. 7% of the workforce is in their first year of teaching. And that's a higher percent than any other year. And it's also the teacher's least effective year as a teacher. And first year teachers are disproportionately represented in these rural schools and hard to staff schools, particularly in North Carolina, and also in our lowest performing schools. When we look at those constant supply sources, we need to think about where those teachers are coming from. In North Carolina, 29% of the teaching workforce or thereabout come from out of state. They're coming from supply states that have now are beginning to see declines in enrollment. We've pulled them in. And in many regards, they're coming to us as first year teachers, and they're being disproportionately placed in those rural schools, hard to staff schools, and low performing schools in their least effective year. And when they get experience, North Carolina is sort of a farm team. When they get experience, they move on to get more coveted, higher paying teaching jobs in other states and locations, perhaps moving back to the states where they were prepared. We also have in North Carolina, about 15% of the workforce are alternatively certified, and they have particularly high rates of turnover in our state. So as using North Carolina as the example, I would challenge people to think about in their state and their regional vicinity, what are those constant supply sources? I think there's also an issue of distribution as much as there is an overall issue of supply within many states. So getting those high need licensure teachers, math, science, middle grades, and special education to teach in the rural or hard to staff schools is a particular challenge. So we have to work together, look at these data points and figure out how we can begin to address not only overall supply, but the distribution of these teachers. And I hope that we've learned some lessons from that in our experiences from the pandemic and distance and online education that we've had to deliver. Perhaps we'll be able to help match up some of those higher need areas to schools and regions in areas of states where they find it particularly difficult to pull in teachers.
Thank you, Alisa. That's all very helpful. So let's turn to a little conversation on what can states and districts do to address the teacher shortage. And let's see, Donna, will you get us started on this question?
I sure will. Thanks for asking this question, because I think there are many different areas. I'm going to start with certainly relationships. One, it's important for teachers to know who we employ at the present time, that we both care about them and who they are. It's also important to know that we care about teaching and learning. We need to create a culture of teaching and learning. So in those relationships, it starts with having the relationships not only with teachers within the workforce, but with state education department, which we're fortunate. I believe that we work hard at that, the New York State Council of School Superintendents, to have a healthy relationship with our state education department. And it also means having a relationship certainly with higher education, so that the preparation pipeline is, and looking at the very early stages in practicum work, that we're developing those relationships, that we're hosting student teachers. I'll leave it to Christina and others to probably talk more about residency programs, but I'm glad that we're looking at that. Certainly other states, Pennsylvania and West Virginia and other states have really set the stage for that work. But I also think in both short-term and long-term, it really is about us recognizing the need for a paradigm shift. The reason why many teachers have left the profession, and many teachers or many people that are considering the profession are saying, perhaps not now, actually started pre-pandemic. The pandemic has somewhat given us a distraction, but pre-pandemic, we were clearly much aware of the fact that the whole focus on teach and test and teach and test and teach and test had become really the beating of a drum that was becoming such that people were leaving the profession. We lost sight professionally, I believe. It's time for a real reset and a paradigm shift. If the medical profession let go of the medical profession, the way that education in some ways has let go of education, I'm not sure where we would be. I can have an operation today and it can be laparoscopic, arthroscopic, and all kinds, and I can walk out of a surgical center in 2 hours with a cane. I graduated from a high school in New York State. You want me to tell you how many credits I had to have in each subject to graduate? Does it sound like today? You want me to tell you how many regents I had to have because it sounds like today? I graduated over 50 years ago. And how much of it still sounds like today? While 50 years ago, I might have been taking a different grade 3 through 8 test or a grade 4 and 6 test. The point is, it became all about the test. And we lost sight of the fact that in New York State and in other states, it's not just what a student needs to know, it's what they're able to do. We lost sight of the fact that we need to be able to allow students to demonstrate their learning and apply their learning to solving a problem so that they can better understand what they need to know and what they know well enough and what they need to strengthen their knowledge in. So it's a paradigm shift. Covey says that if we want to change small things, we change our habits. We've been tinkering with habits for years. If we want to change big things, we shift our paradigms. So the paradigm shift has to be about what is really teaching and learning supposed to be focused on. Is it really supposed to still be the subjects that were determined by the Committee of 10 in 1892 or 1893? Or should it be beyond that, those areas that also develop what we might call soft skills, professional skills? I'd call them essential skills. How do we really redesign the system so that teachers both want to teach and they are respected for teaching and learning in a way that honors what it really is all about? I think that our district and other districts in New York State have set the stage for that. It is more about shifting to project-based learning, problem solving, having capstone projects, having multiple means of assessment. I think state ed would like to help us with that. I know that they would. I see the work that's going on in CTE. But beyond state and district, it has to be also the federal government has to recognize that as long as you tie our dollars to these old outdated paradigms of testing, we really won't move in a way we could and should as a country. And that's why we are faltering with STEM and with other areas, because we're still in an outdated 19th century, maybe at the best 20th century model. And it's hard for school systems and states to break from that model. So we really need a revolution. We need to reset, and we need to really broaden our sights so that we can not only recruit, but we can retain teachers. And I'll hold my other comments for later, but in the immediate short term, I would say the other things that we're doing is hiring early. We're developing recruitment fairs. We have teacher substitutes that are year-long, that are hired year-long. So we have a relationship. The minute a subject opens, you're one of the people that are being interviewed. We have to do those kinds of things so that people know we're very serious about this profession, just like you would be in a residency for the medical profession. But I think that we've held out too long. We have to really embrace arms between our organizations, our state education departments, our higher education institutions, and our school districts, and move this entire field forward. So that's my 2 cents on this.
Thanks, Donna. Much appreciated. Christine, what are your thoughts on this question?
You teed up a whole bunch of great points, Donna. I really appreciate it. And I'm finding myself drawing not only on my work as a teacher educator here, but I'm also on my local school board. And so drawing from across these contexts, I think so much of what you said has resonated with me. So just a couple of things I want to kind of add in here. One is in thinking about this paradigm shift you're talking about, and really thinking about what are we looking for our graduates, our young people to graduate K-12, and then even to graduate, in our teacher preparation programs, getting away from just counting those sort of credit units, getting away from the teach to test kind of connection that so many students experience. It puts me in mind of, I was teaching one of my courses today, and I had a pre-service teacher in there who's a chemistry teacher. I teach literacy classes, so this is literacy across the content areas, but she raised the point where she said, I'm not sure how much of this is going to be able to apply to my classes, because so much of what I'm going to have to do is basically teach to the regents. And so that was her perception of the purpose of like what she had developed from, and she's a sophomore in college, of what she had interpreted that the purpose of high school chemistry was to pass the regents. And that brought the whole class to sort of a pause point where we needed to sort of take a step back and say, well, what is the purpose? What is, where do these tests fall? Why are they put there? But I think that speaks so much to what you're talking about, Donna, of the concern of how students are interpreting the purpose of school, and how young people in our schools are interpreting the purpose of school. And that if they're interpreting it as the teacher is basically the technician that just needs to deliver as a delivery method, then that is a much less exciting, field to go into. What we're seeing, from this, I'm going to draw from my Board of Ed work. I think there are schools certainly in this area, in the capital region, that are looking, and nationwide, that are looking at kind of expanding, defining and redefining as districts, what are we looking for in our graduates? So for example, there's a portrait of a graduate program that some of our local districts have participated in that is really pushing the district as a whole and the communities to start to think, what are those life skills, those, I can't remember the term you used, Donna, but not soft skills, but those skills that.
As essential skills.
Essential skills, I liked that a lot, yeah. What are those skills that we want young people to come out of school with, alongside the content knowledge, alongside the strategies and the thinking? Couple of other quick things that I'll just mention in terms of what states and districts can do. One of the things that we've tried to do here as a partnership in our higher ed context is to place some of our beginning education courses in college in the classroom, college in the high school classes, which allows students to start to see and to start to think of education. So supporting that kind of a program. where we could say, like, let's have an issues in education or a child psychology class that we might be able to place in the high school as a junior or senior year, that lets us start to plant those seeds early. And then I think the other thing that you talked about really well, Donna, is opening those opportunities to our student teachers, because when students at the high school and middle school level are seeing, and elementary level, are seeing young people that are excited about this profession, I think that that makes a big difference for them being able to then imagine themselves possibly going into those roles. So definitely, I think, you know, there's others that can probably speak even better to residency. I think the residency programs and partnerships between BOCES and districts and regions and thinking creatively about placements across a region, so that if you do, I can't remember who, Chuck, I think it was you that was talking about, sometimes we end up with a one-off job that we need, like in one district, like they just need one section. But if we can look at placements that might be shared across some different schools in these rural districts, I think that's another option.
Thanks, Christina and Donna. Okay, let's go on to our next question. So, okay, so now what actions can you suggest to recruit and retain strong teachers? Lynn, do you want to get us started on this one?
I'm busy looking up resources that I can share with everyone since the chat seems to be pretty active. Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, and this has been mentioned previously, money. Money to go to school, to become a highly qualified teacher, and money to support teachers once they're in the classroom. And, you know, one of the things that we've been working on, which is what I've been trying to pull up here, and I'll put it in the chat, is money for teacher candidates. So we have been working with Senator Jack Reed from Rhode Island and Representative Alma Adams, Alisa, from your great state of North Carolina, who both have co-sponsored something called the Educators for America Act. And the Educators for America Act addresses Title III of the Higher Education Act, which looks specifically at financial aid for future educators. And so I would encourage all of you to learn more about the Educators for America Act and to actually reach out to your elected officials at the federal level to get their support for that, because it directly addresses how we can support with greater, not just loan aid, but grant aid, scholarship aid for future teachers. That's incredibly important. So I would say that's one of the things we can first do to recruit, is to recruit them into our, what I don't call traditional anymore, I call comprehensive programs of teacher education and educator preparation, because many of them aren't that traditional anymore. So so we can use some different terms there. I also think that in terms of support, we've been partnering with an entity called the National Center for Grow Your Own. So Grow Your Own programs have become incredibly popular, and as they should. And so the National Center for Grow Your Own is an outgrowth of the work that was done in the state of Tennessee, where the state of Tennessee was able to become a state where there could be registered apprenticeships. And so using Department of Labor funds, we have an opportunity to have teacher candidates receive support through the Department of Labor as apprentices inside of school districts for clinical practice, for residency. And so we have an institution in Tennessee, Austin Peay University, that has partnered with its local school district to create those kind of registered apprenticeships. So it's a partnership between the local school district and the local EPP. Incredibly important to make sure that those two are connected. You know, one of the things that we've been doing, and you know, Donna, I so appreciated your remarks about a paradigm shift. And I'm not sure if you know this or not, but AASA is working with AACTE and Arizona State University. Arizona State University, you talk about a paradigm shift, has a new program. Well, it's not as new anymore. I'm going to try to not mute myself and get to my other screen here so I can share this with you. ASU is working on something called the Next Educator Workforce. And that is taking the one teacher, one classroom model and kind of throwing it out the window and saying, in today's world, teachers cannot be expected to be everything to everyone. And I'm sure, you know, Carly, I keep calling you out, but I'm sure you're going to talk about this, right? I mean, you are the person who teaches students, who has to worry about their social emotional learning, who has to be concerned with what they walk into the classroom with. What's their food security? Are they being fed? I mean, a teacher today is not just teaching a curriculum, or is teaching, even teaching to the test, and that's a whole nother conversation, right? So we need to make sure that teachers have support. And so Arizona State has a model that they are working with us on. It's being currently used inside of Mesa School District in Arizona, which is the largest school district in Arizona, to actually bring in what they call distributed expertise. So teachers who, okay, Donna, I'm going back to you again. So you talked about what would happen inside of medicine, right? It essentially, if you were in a hospital room, as I was several years ago, and you looked at a chart that said, this is your occupational therapist, this is your physical therapist, this is your doctor, this is your nurse, right? None of us really are treated anymore singularly by one person in the medical field. We're treated by a team. It's the same concept in education. So we'd be looking at, what would that team be? It's not team teaching, it's bigger than that. What is the team that supports that student? The school counselor, the teaching assistant, maybe not just one teacher, but 3 teachers. And how do we wrap that to serve the whole child? So it's a very different approach. I think it's an innovative approach. And these are the kinds of things that I think could recruit strong teachers. If we show the capacity to support them financially, if we show the capacity to think differently about the jobs we've asked them to do, and if we elevate the profession through the work of local school districts, through the work at the state level, and through the work at the federal level. You know, Chuck, I know you'll have a different approach given the viewpoint you have, and so I'll be quiet now and have you jump in, as I think you're the other person helping me answer this question.
Yes, Chuck, take it away.
I'll get specific on a couple of things that I think people can do in their district. One, it was mentioned earlier, relationships. Relationships matter. As folks on this Zoom know, I was superintendent in a couple of places where I worked closely with the University of Albany. I worked closely with College of St. Rose, Russell Sage College, in order to bring in people who would help what was happening in the school. Future teachers. The relationships with those future teachers who we were able to bring in was wonderful for the students, was wonderful for the current faculty, but it was also a great pipeline for us to be able to recruit really good people. But part of the problem is, one is a lot of leaders, I mean superintendents, principals, teacher leaders, teachers, they're in their classroom, they're in their building, they're in their district. They're not going out and being with Ginny at the University of Albany and talking about the needs of their districts. That's one of the things that all leaders need to do. And by leaders, I don't mean school superintendents. I mean the leader of the kindergarten classes, the teacher that the teacher leader of that group. That person needs to be too. The second thing, a very specific thing is, and it was mentioned a moment ago, I think Lynn mentioned it, is the grow your own, the pipeline. We have a built-in pipeline in schools, and we don't take advantage of it. We have students who aspire to be teachers. We send them off to college and they go off to college and we never talk to them again. We have aides who would like to be teacher assistants. We have teacher assistants who would like to be teachers. we've got these people, we've got teacher assistants who are tenured. They've done a great job. Let's help them financially. Let's help them in terms of working with a college or a university so they can get their teaching degree and step into a classroom, make more money, have a greater impact on the students. And the other important thing with those people is that we're talking there a lot, we're talking about the people who live in your school district. And that's one of those things, boards of education love hiring people that live in your school district. And by using the built-in pipeline that you have, whether it be students, aides, or teacher assistants, and creating a mechanism for them to become teachers and a mechanism for them to become administrators as well, you are creating an opportunity for people, and you're creating a pipeline to your classrooms.
Thanks, Chuck. So we're going to move on to the next question. I know this is a question on many people's mind as well. How can we strengthen teacher preparation program initiatives to increase the diversity of educators in classrooms? So Christine, do you want to get us started on this one?
I missed my mute button. Sure. I was just thinking about a couple of things related to this. One is I want to piggyback on what Chuck was just saying with the pipeline issue. And I think that's relevant in this question also. I didn't originally have that in my notes for this, but you know, in hearing him talk about that, one of the things I think that we found, and again, kind of my two worlds between the Board of Ed and between my work in teacher preparation, is the need for collaboration between some of the people that are supporting those people moving through the pipeline. So for example, like how do you navigate placements if you have somebody who's in a teacher assistant or a teacher aide program and is working on certification? How do we help them navigate the world of the higher ed and the teacher preparation program and the world of HR in their district? Like opening those lines of communication between HR, between the building administrator and the support people that are at the campus. Another thing I think that definitely ties in with this, we've been using the Teacher Opportunity Corps program, the grants that are offered by state ed. And that's one of the things we're doing at my institution here. And one of the features of that this year that I think is a change in the program, but I think is really critical to this is looking at not just the K-12 and the higher ed, but also looking at community partners in supporting and recruiting and retaining. So looking deeper into the relationships between the candidates that we're trying to, to support into those programs. I think another big part of this is looking at access. I mean, this is a theme that's coming up across other speakers is money and resources, but absolutely access to placements, access to opportunities that are at the higher education level, but then also helping candidates who may be from varied socioeconomic backgrounds to get access if they, we might have candidates who are from the city who don't have a car. How do we help them get to placements that aren't just right next door to the campus? How do we help them also kind of branch out in those placements? Two other things that I'll mention before I hand it over, because I'm sure that I think there's a couple more people on this topic. One is really thinking about what candidates' lives look like inside the placements themselves. So really looking at mentoring structures that are in those placements and having spaces where candidates who may be from more varied backgrounds than the placement that they're entering, what kind of supports can we offer them at the campus? What kind of supports can the K-12 district offer them when they are entering into that placement? And what kind of mentoring, even if we need to, again, look across lines of districts. I think we need to expand our thinking so that we're looking at consortiums of districts and consortiums of schools to say, we're moving candidates into these schools, and how can we provide structures of support and structures of mentoring, even if some of those structures of support and mentoring are not already present in those schools, if that makes sense. So I'll leave it at that and pass it on to the next group because I think there's a couple of us.
Thanks, Christine. We just had our accepted open house Sunday, and I had 2 or 3 asking me about the transportation specifically and bus lines for student teaching. It was interesting, the questions we were getting right now. Okay, so I'm going to move to Jacob.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'm going to echo some other sentiments because I think they're quite important. First, I want to go back to something that Donna mentioned. She didn't use these words, but what I heard resonating was elevating the profession. And I think when we, particularly around all candidates, but candidates of color, who perhaps may have other options, and we want them to work in schools, is being able to articulate the quality of preparation, why preparation is important. And we can use some of that through our current structures, through our assessment systems. How do we know about the quality of our programs, and how do we know that our programs have an ROI that leads to high levels of placement in jobs and retention? But more than that, most teachers will all say that one reason why they go into school is to be able to have a positive impact on the lives of youth, children, and their communities. And so how do we know that our programs are preparing individuals to, in fact, effectuate those high levels? So I think taking ownership over the quality of how we talk about the quality of preparation and the meaning of preparation. And then as Christine talked about access, I want to talk about it a bit differently because there's some big issues, as have been alluded to. We haven't really unpacked those yet in terms of residencies and paid residencies for internships during preparation. But there are things that universities can do in terms of thinking about access. How do we structure our admissions processes, even in alignment with the state minimum requirements? I'm speaking specifically for the graduate level because we have our programs are only graduate level. And then how do those, looking at the data, are we disenfranchising certain communities? And if so, how do we address those? Thinking about it, access in terms of the cost of books. I've seen programs whereby just the cost of books for one course alone can be several $100s. So thinking about other ways in which books are on loan in the library and things of that nature. We're in New York City, so transportation in terms of cars is not usually a focus, but I think that's very important because different contexts have different ideas of what access might be. And ultimately, I believe that because we know that, for example, men of color are about nationally 2% of the teacher population. Even for programs like ours that are doing really well with diversity, we are not doing as well as we should be with recruiting men of color. And so building culturally responsive and supportive practices within programs and post program once individuals are placed in schools. New York City Men Teach, for example, had the goal of producing 1,000 men of color. Recruiting and hiring 1,000 men of color for New York City. In 2018, that was exceeded. So creating these sort of environments where those who may not look like the rest of the candidate population have a culture or spaces of affirmation and affirming so that they can, in a sense, have places to talk about maybe struggles they're having that are different from the rest of the candidate population. And then what those and how they might be able to persevere and persist within the program. And the same for once they've been placed in schools. So I'll stop there for a minute and turn it over to Lynn.
Thanks, Jacob. It's good to hear your voice. When I was, Jacob and I, so Truro University just did what was it called, Jacob? A World Book Day?
World Book Day.
World Book Day. And Jacob started out and I followed him and he read this wonderful book where he sang some Negro spirituals along the way. And I had to follow him and I thought, I'm not singing and no one should hear me sing. So Jacob, it's good to see you again. Jacob's been on our board and just really has been a mover and a shaker in the field.
Thank you. It's kind.
So, one of the things that I always do is I want to understand sort of the context in terms of how we've gotten to where we are right now. And, I'd be remiss if I didn't recommend a book to you that's coming out by AACTE's Dean in Residence, Dr. Leslie Fenwick. And she has written a book called Jim Crow's Pink Slip. And it is about, my language, the eradication of Black educators after Brown versus Board of Ed. And so, unfortunately, our need now to diversify, we missed an opportunity when we were desegregating schools and Black educators were left behind, Black teachers, Black principals, Black, you can look at the history of African Americans in our country and the importance of education to our African American brothers and sisters. And so where we find ourselves now is making up for lost time. We know that the majority of our educators are white women, and that we need to diversify around gender, around race and ethnicity, around sexual orientation. And so there are many ways that we need to truly look at strengthening the diversity of educators in our classroom, because our children need to see people like them. And what we know is that when a child can have, a white female teacher who understands culturally responsive teaching, who understands how to work the classroom with the multitudes of children she has, we're better. When we have diverse teachers who look like the students that they're educating, we're better. And so there are a couple of things that I just wanted to point out again from the national level. One of them is a network improved community that AACTE did on recruiting and retaining Black and Latino, Black African-American Latino men into the profession. There were 10 institutions that participated in that. There are case studies associated with that. I mean, there are several programs around the country that do exceptionally good work. One that we often talk about is Clemson University's Call Me Mr. program. They actually have done work also with a historically Black college and university. I think we can learn a lot from our minority serving institutions. HBCUs still educate the greatest number of Black educators in this country. And so I just, want to point that out as well. We've looked at, and I'm going to put this into the chat again. We have looked at how test scores and how state policy around who's admitted into our colleges of education and our programs of teacher education can impact whether or not we allow those students into teacher candidacy. And so what I've put into the chat is a paper that Leslie Fenwick, again, Dr. Fenwick did, that undergirds the work that we're doing in something called a Consortium for Research-Based and Equitable Assessments, CREA. So we're looking at how states establish cut scores for entrance into educator preparation programs, and then working with, again, you've all talked about relationships, and what we have found is that we don't always have the right people talking to the right people in the same room talking together. And then policy gets passed and it isn't always within the context that is necessary to serve the greater good. And so this program, which is Gates funded, is something that we've been doing to look at how to evaluate cut scores for entrance into educator preparation programs. And so those are just some of the things that I wanted to mention. And I see in the chat that Andrea has put in something from SUNY Cortland that's a successful model for mentoring. We have students of color coming into not just educator preparation programs that are predominantly white, but also school districts as well. And so when we think about how to retain both teacher candidates and teachers of color, we do need wraparound support, and likely, and this goes back to a commentary that was made earlier, the induction years are so critical. And so having those partnerships between EPPs and the local school districts, I think, can help that as well.
Thanks all. So what we're going to do on the next slide, Jerry's already got us to the next slide. We have about a third of the time of what we had. So we're going to do these as fast answers when we get to each one. If you could try and keep it maybe to a minute, that might help us get through some of these. I'm going to jump around a little bit as well. So let's start with what should high quality teacher induction programs include? And Christina, do you want to go first?
Yes, just had to figure out how to unmute.
Yeah.
So, so I'll try to keep this brief. I've really been enjoying listening to the conversation. And one of the things I think we need to think about is trying some new things. For far too long, we have had the same model. All of us had the same model in student teaching. You have a placement, couple placements, you have a cooperating teacher, you have a supervisor, and there's been some changes with that. There's a lot more online supervising now, but basically that model has been the same. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about is whether or not that kind of model works. And obviously to a certain extent it does, but we also have, I think, some issues with a lot of people, especially now with the pandemic, who get to student teaching and they could benefit from some additional help. And, in someone's first year teaching, we have mentoring programs, but we really don't have that at the pre-service teacher level. And I'll put this into the chat. This is an article. This is one that I wrote myself. So know your source. I was trying to tell my students that, but I do think it applies, and it's something that was a couple of years ago. Myself and a practicing teacher who's an alum of our program, we did a very small scale study. But essentially what we did, and we put this forth as a new model, and it might be interesting to try something like this in some other settings. Very briefly, what we did is we said, well, you've got your cooperating teacher, you've got your supervisor, you have a seminar instructor, but all of those people for a student teacher are in charge of evaluating them. There's nobody there who's mentoring and supporting them who isn't also taking notes on how they're doing. So what we tried doing is having another person. We called that person a critical confidant, and the role, and we found that student teachers basically like this. And if you want more info, you can read the article. But essentially, student teachers, we kept the program the same, but we matched them with somebody who was a little bit older, had a little bit more teaching experience. So maybe somebody who'd been teaching 3, 4, 5 years. So somebody, you think of Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, somebody who was relatively close to them in age and experience level, but had just a little bit more. And we set it up where student teachers could talk with that person, whenever they wanted. The two of them work things out together. And basically what we found is that person was a great source of support. And all those things that a student teacher might not feel comfortable asking their cooperating teacher or their supervisor, because they're also being evaluated, were things that they could talk to their critical confidant person about. And so we really think that that's a missing thing. And it might be something, just as we start to think about how do we support new folks and student teachers a bit more. It's just a possible idea. So just kind of something to add to the conversation, for us to think about.
Thanks, Christina. Alisa, do you want to add to this conversation on high quality teacher induction programs?
Sure, just a few thoughts. Often when we think about the national teacher shortage, we attribute it to the insufficient supply of teachers. But what I'd like to suggest is that the data tell us that the shortages are most likely due to difficulty with teacher retention. So I think this is a really critical problem we need to think about and look at the circumstances within our own states and the regional vicinity and how we can begin to address the issue of teacher retention. There are national data that show overall cost of teacher turnover as high as $7 billion. In North Carolina alone, over $84 million a year. It costs much less to focus on the support and retention of teachers. So if we can get the elements of support in those induction years, those beginning years of teachers together and have a well-funded program, we can save money in the long run by helping those teachers become better teachers over time. In terms of elements of good support for beginning teachers, I would suggest 3 elements that we have found work well in combination together. One is instructional coaching, so working with those teachers in their first 3 years of service on lesson and strategy demonstrations, co-teaching, observations with real-time feedback, planning, induction, and assessment support, weekly face-to-face discussions with those beginning teachers, and individualized professional development. And that would encompass, you know, a more comprehensive model of instructional coaches for those beginning teachers. We've also found that intensive institute to help those beginning teachers with targeted knowledge and skills that they need most for beginning teachers. And then the third element would be professional development, not only for those classroom teachers, but to the supports that they have within their schools as well. So if we can coordinate those elements and begin to really focus on support for beginning teachers, I think we'll go a long way in helping to solve the overall challenge of teacher supply and demand.
Thank you. So we're going to move to the next question then. So other than high quality induction programs for new teachers, what strategies can schools employ to improve retention? And Carly, why don't you get us started on this one?
Thank you so much. I really love to advocate for school districts and school buildings within those districts, allowing teachers to collaborate more. I know that I thrive when I have the opportunity to work with my peers, and I am consistently advocating for schools and districts to set up programs within their building that give teachers the flexibility to work with each other during the school day for planning and co-planning, as well as co-teaching to see those lessons through. I am an agriculture teacher, which means that I work across all of this disciplines with many different teachers at many different grade levels. And I know how much of an ask it is for my peers to make that time for me after school or before school to get things done. So I think it's absolutely essential that we support the collaboration of teachers by giving them the time and the space and the funds to see those projects through.
Thank you, Carly. Let's see. Christine, do you want to jump in on this one?
Yeah, I'll just add 2 quick things. One is I think having that time within the school day and supported and funded within the school day that Carly mentioned is I think right on point. We need to see this collaboration as part of the work and part of the job, as opposed to something that teachers need to do and sort of add on for their own good after hours. I also think that, again, I want to come back to this idea of looking across districts to find mentoring opportunities and networking opportunities when we're looking at supporting an ongoing professional development. I think that a lot of times it is really useful to approach what Christina is talking about with this coaching and critical friends who are not in an evaluative standpoint, and to look for opportunities where you might have groups of teachers that are at a similar point or sharing a similar inquiry that can work together, whether across in New York might be across a BOCES or across a group of related districts. And then the other thing I would say is that I think we have a lot we can learn from really successful models of ongoing professional development. And I would absolutely direct your attention to the National Writing Project. They do fantastic work to support teachers in really engaging in inquiry across content areas, lesson study, and that sort of thing that I think are parts of